I have here the very first photograph ever taken. Well, not really, it's just a bad printout of it. The original is actually at the University of Texas at Austin. But that's beside the point. The image is a blurry impression of some buildings, a courtyard, and a roof. It was produced using a device called a camera obscura, a darkened room with a small hole or a lens on one side. This one was produced by covering up a window and leaving a small hole in the covering. Due to the way the physics of light works, a curious thing happens inside of a space like this. An image forms on the opposite side of the room from the hole, but the image is flipped upside down. The light rays converge through the small hole and they continue their angled path until they're projected onto the other wall. And that image that's projected is the view that one would have if they had their eye right up to the hole. It took an entire room to make this photograph, whose subject is a view of other buildings as seen through the frame of a window. Architecture is clearly an important part of photography. It was there at every level from the beginning. In fact, a lot of early photographs were taken of buildings, and this is because of the chemical processes used to etch the image onto the accepting material or substrate. It required a lot of time to properly react. In the case of that first photograph, it took 8 hours of exposing the bitumen-covered plate to produce that grainy picture. Not too many willing subjects can sit for so many hours, but buildings were uniquely up to the task. Over time, chemists have found ways to tweak the processes until they became quick enough to capture human subjects. But at first, they had to sit stiffly with no smile, because an image would still take a long time to form and people had to find a comfortable place that they could keep for a while. Contrast this with one of the most famous architectural photographers, Iwan Baan. He's famous for being able to capture the unexpected and quick-moving life inside of buildings and for being on the move himself. In a typical week, he might be in Basel, Switzerland on Friday, Saturday in Zurich, Monday in Bilbao, Tuesday Madrid, Wednesday Murcia, Thursday Cartagena, and Friday in New York. In fact, he spends only about 2 weeks a year in his own apartment, meanwhile racking up hundreds of thousands of airline miles to visit all the buildings that he's commissioned to photograph. He's the preferred photographer of almost every influential architect today, like Herzog and de Meuron, Rem Koolhaas, and Stephen Hall, among others. But what is it that makes him so popular as an architectural photographer? What is it about his images that stand out among the rest? Well, it does have to do with his desire for constant movement and how this shapes the way that he sees buildings. One of his go-to techniques is hopping into a helicopter to get away from his subject and be able to observe it from the sky. From here, he's able to capture how a building interacts with its surroundings, how it shapes them, and how they shape the building. For instance, after Hurricane Sandy, while half of Manhattan was plunged into darkness without power, Baan boarded a helicopter and captured images of the city in its battered state. One of these made it onto the cover of the New Yorker magazine and became an iconic image of 2012. But once he lands on the ground, Baan is fascinated by how people behave in new spaces and how people explore them in this time of unease. Anyone might show up in the cast of his images, featuring their everyday activity with the architecture as their backdrop. A dog pulling a man along a bicycle, 2 joggers, a man on a phone, or a woman lugging her groceries. This idea of mobility and people are what makes photography so important to architecture in general. It's pretty difficult to view buildings in their native context, and this can be prohibitive for their study. Even more, some buildings are private and you wouldn't be granted access even if you did show up at their doorstep. But photographs, they move at the speed of light, and we can visit so many more buildings through their photographs than we can physically with our own bodies. The photograph becomes a sort of stand-in for when a building can't be where you want it. So architects really rely on photographers to be able to capture their design intentions. And this too is how certain architectural photographers become synonymous with certain architects or with architectural movements. And this is true for people like Julius Shulman. He was a photographer whose primary subject were modern houses during the 1940s through the 1960s in California. And while Iwan Baan has a more casual snapshot style, Shulman's photographs were highly constructed and meticulously staged affairs. Lighting, transparency, shapes, textures, and human models are all perfectly in their place to convey a life of affluence and leisure through good design. His case study House Number 22 in Los Angeles might be the most famous architectural photograph of all time. It features 2 well-dressed women conversing with a heroically cantilevered building hovering above the dancing lights of Los Angeles. While appearing spontaneous, the image is actually highly constructed. Through the camera placement and our focus, we as observers were like voyeurs looking into the action on the outside of an exclusive life of privilege. Early on in his career, Shulman worked for another photographer named Ezra Stoller. Rather than focusing on domestic environments like Shulman eventually did, Stoller's photographers were more abstract and heroic, showing spaces as sweeping curves springing from off a frame or highly contrasting textures and shapes. Stoller turned buildings into monumental works of art through his camera lens. Even in this early photo of a modest house by Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer called the Chamberlain Cottage, the diminutive structure looks grand and impressive. This is all carefully constructed. Stoller agonized over every single detail of every photograph that he ever took, including things like the angle of the open window and even how the logs are stacked up underneath the building. He told an interviewer in 1990 about his typical working method that I would wander around the building and make notes with arrows on the plans. When this was all done, I'd put a time next to each arrow, and when I was all through, the day would be gone. So the next day, hopefully it was a sunny day again, I'd go back and make all those pictures. A Stoller photograph could make your building famous, and the process of his images capturing and propelling a building to celebrity was called getting Stollerized. But eventually, over time, into the 1970s, architectural preferences and interests swung another way. There was no longer a desire to make the ordinary seem monumental and extraordinary. Instead, architects were more interested in the inherent beauty lurking inside of the ordinary. And architects like Venturi Scott Brown turned to photographers like Stephen Shore to capture the reality of everyday lives. They commissioned him to tour the United States as part of their show Signs of Life, which I talked about in the episode of Curb Appeal, linked up here somewhere. Shore helped the architects to pay attention to the average moments of life and not just the dramatic ones. He photographed main streets, but also car parks, road signs, gas stations, and shop fronts, as well as the furniture in his rented motel rooms and the food he had for breakfast. He used all sorts of cameras and hardly ever staged anything or even used a flash. This is almost the complete opposite of Shulman and Stoller. Shore would famously only take one shot of his subject though, and he would do very little editing of the image afterwards. Shore's approach to photography is both deadpan, straightforward, and unglamorous. He would say, "What I was trying to do was take pictures that looked like they weren't composed. I wanted to get away from the visual conventions of photography, the weight of tradition that informed how you were supposed to structure a photograph. Basically, I wanted to take screwy pictures, but intentionally screwy pictures." Venturi Scott Brown, the architects who commissioned Shore, they were pretty screwy too, and they designed architecture that tried to learn from the way that he was appreciating the world. They wanted to create buildings that revel in the unplanned and the everyday, and even to create buildings that would work like a picture. For instance, their design for the NFL Hall of Fame is called a building board, because the main inhabitable hall hides behind a giant flat image that's meant to be seen from the nearby highway. While very few photographers still take photos with actual film, and images have never been more easily shareable, architecture is consumed at an alarming rate. In lesser hands, this knowledge that a building might mostly be constructed for an image, it can lead to some cynical interpretations, where architects only design to produce the most Instagrammable image, while neglecting all the other parts of the building that are important. While this is certainly rampant, firms like Johnston Mark Lee have turned it into an art form. Their design process for the project called the Hill House actually begins with the famous Julius Shulman photograph that we talked about before, the one for the case study house. Rather than trying to make the building to produce a great image, they start with the photograph and produce the building from it. They take Shulman's image and through collage create new architectural possibilities. They erase parts of it, or at least color them in white, to imply a form for a building around the windows that strays from the familiar plans of the original. It reframes the interior condition without alluding to things like what materials the eventual building might be made from. The house itself then maintains the abstraction of the collage with a smooth, white, faceted form. It engages the hill like a gem popping out, and it actually completely fills out the buildable area of the site, which is controlled by various zoning regulations, and those actually give it the final form. A sculpture that is completely dependent on its context. The whiteness of the building, then, is both on the interior and the exterior, and it creates a complete visual contrast with the color and texture of the surroundings. And from the inside, this makes the window look even more like a picture hanging on the wall. In the end, the building isn't very similar to the one that's in Shulman's original photograph, but it will always have that association due to this part of its design process. And photography is actually really important to this house at all levels. The house actually shows up in the Johnston Mark Lee's book called A House is a House is a House is a House. And in it, they challenge the conventional model where architects commission photographers to make the house look perfect or heroic. Instead, they choose to collaborate with the artists, who reinterpret the building in their own way. The voice of each feature photographer is made explicit as a kind of co-author, and the book presents multiple points of view of the same buildings. And this is where the strange name for the book comes from. A house is a house is a house is a house. Anyway, the Hill House shows up multiple times in the book in grainy, spooky night shots, comic book styled framed images with talk bubbles that animate the building, and some reminiscent of what Julius Shulman might do if he was alive today. But my favorite collaboration in the book is around another house called a sale house, and it's interpreted by the artist Livia Corona. She stages these elaborate scenes with elderly actors engaging in a series of absurd activities. The house has these intense colors on the interior, and the actors actually dress in the same colors as the architecture as they engage with these strange furniture inside of an otherwise barren spaces. Let's continue the conversation about architectural photography down in the discussion section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this subject. Which photographs are your favorites, or which photographers today are making waves? If you enjoyed this video, I'd be really grateful if you consider giving it a like, maybe subscribing to the channel, or even joining with a membership if you're so inclined. All of this kind of engagement really helps us to bring content to you every week on Thursdays. And in the meantime, you might enjoy some of these other videos to tide you over until the next Thursday rolls around.